Okay, welcome back. My name is Derek Main and I review translated literature. I'm really excited about today's review. It is Revenge of the Translator by Brice Matthieussent, translated from the French by Emma Ramadan, and it is from Deep Vellum, publisher in Dallas that I love very much. Does a lot of wonderful translated fiction. I'll actually talk about them at the end briefly to recommend a book that I won't have time to review. But this was incredible. It was, to me, a must-read for any fans of translated literature. I think it's close to a must-read for any fans of literary fiction in general. I thought it was brilliant. I am actually surprised there has not been more of a buzz around this book, or perhaps there has, and I just haven't caught it. I'm not claiming to be at all plugged into sort of that world. This is a really, really fun read. And it brings up some just tremendous questions that we as readers have to ask ourselves about translations. So I'm going to try to give you the quick little synopsis, but as you'll see, this is complicated. So this book follows Trad, who is a translator. He is translating a metafictional novel called Translator's Revenge. It's an English translation of a novel by a French author, Abel Prout, that Trad is translating back into French. The book that he's translating, Translator's Revenge, again written by Abel Prout, is a book about the relationship between this writer, French writer, and American translator, and the sort of push and pull, and it's not a very nice relationship. It's full of tricks and puzzles. It's got a sort of steamy love affair in the middle where the author and the translator are both with the same woman. But then this whole thing is the story of Trad, the translator of that, bringing this to translation and then going rogue. So he is changing aspects of the translation completely, ignoring parts, making up sections of whole cloth, and it's really an exploration of the translator's role in bringing work to another language. Okay, that's, I think, as succinct as I can do that. It's complicated, but they do a great job of letting you know kind of who at that moment is the one writing, or at least who's the one in charge of the writing at that moment, by whether it's below the fold in a footnote or above the fold. And the sections kind of make it very clear. So while it sounds really complex, and it is sort of a puzzle and a riddle, and that's one of the really awesome, fun things about this book, it's easy to follow. Like you won't get like super lost. Real quick, because every review, and including I think on the back cover, and even it might be mentioned once in the book, is going to talk about Pale Fire by Nabokov. This is one of the best books ever written. I love this book. And I think, yes, obviously stylistically, or at least stylistically might actually be the wrong word, but it's got a similar theme running through it where, in Pale Fire, it is a 999 line poem that is being brought to us and also critiqued in the moment by the narrator. But honestly, I think it does it a little bit of an injustice to compare the two in terms of what they are trying to say. First off, comparing anything to something like Pale Fire is not quite fair, because this is one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. But also, I think they have two completely different goals. And so I'm not going to spend my review kind of dissecting those comparisons. And we're going to focus instead, particularly because I focus on translated literature, on what this is about. And this is about the translator and the author of the original text in conflict, continuous conflict, as the author wants to be understood, and obviously they want to be widely read, but they want their words to be translated correctly and carefully, and you get the right meaning and intent, while the translator, the author is suspect of the translator and thinks that the translator is messing with his master work, and in fact, in this case, the translator is. So maybe there's reason to fear. I'll give you a quick. I really liked this on page 99. This is kind of that translator versus author dichotomy. Zorro is the name here of the character. It's nobody's character's name. The translator in this moment is dressed up as Zorro. So when I say Zorro, that just means the translator. Zorro zigzagging, wandering, and getting lost, while I trace a pure, straight, invisible line. And I really like that aspect of the translator has a puzzle that they need to solve. They have a riddle, an enigma, and they are working through this text to try their very best to get the original intent and meaning, while we are working with two different languages and different cultures and different understandings and references, whereas the author draws a straight line because he is, it's a he in this case, is just writing in one language, one culture, one reference, and he does not have all of those sort of pitfalls and problems that can come up, or at least he doesn't think he does. I'll argue in a minute that he does. Another thing I really liked was about the power of the translator, because that's another aspect. While they are wandering and while they are, riddled with problems and issues they have to solve, they also have a great deal of power. And in a footnote to a footnote on 113, this translator, not Emma Ramadan, but the translator Trad, who's the novel's narrator for most of it, says, "From here on out, I wield significant power." And that's the thing that we're invited to consider, the power of the translator. And I think that one of the things that this book really is wonderfully, it invites you to do, is think about, well, how much did Emma Ramadan mess with the text, if at all? And I think the reason it asks you that, there is an epilogue that mentions her and mentions that, now this will be translated, which actually I didn't think was necessary, because you're thinking it throughout the process. So I really don't think that you need to put in the epilogue, but it's like 2 pages. It's not a big deal. But one of the reasons it asks you that is because that's what the book is about. So you obviously in English are sitting there questioning, like, I don't know French and I can't find I wouldn't be able to do anything with the original source material. So is this being faithful, or is anything being changed? We're going to circle back to that, because I have a thought on that with some criticism that I have of it, actually, of the book. So 2 other passages I want to show real quick. One was on the role of reading, because it's not just the translator and author conflict, but eventually the audience is the reader, and the author wants to be understood, the translator wants to be faithful to the text, and all of this is in service of, eventually, the reader. Reading is a certain way going against life, turning your back to it, or at least exiling yourself for a moment, at risk of missing the most intense moments that no clamor will ever signal to the reader absorbed in his book. I really like that. I think about that a lot. There are, times when you are immersed in a book and life is happening all around you, and it does feel like a protest of sorts. It feels like you are turning against life. Now, I don't think you are turning against life in so much as understanding life. In fact, I think that reading is one of the most powerful ways that you can educate yourself on the world, on the culture, and be a fuller, richer, more aware person. It provides you with a tremendous amount of empathy, particularly reading translated literature, particularly reading women in translation. For me as a man, and anything that is outside of my own experience and understanding. So, but I do like the idea of reading as turning your back to life, at least in that brief moment. One other thing is actually, I was going to go into my favorite section because the whole thing kind of flips really quick into turning into something else. But I've tried my best with this channel to make it not something where I would spoil anything. So I really, if you've watched a couple of mine, I think you can tell, my basic goal is for somebody who hasn't read the book to maybe look at this and then kind of decide if they'd like to or not. And then for someone who has read it to just get a sense of what my general thoughts were overall, thematically, with the format, but what I don't want to do is necessarily get into spoilers. And this book makes it difficult because so much of the fun is watching this thing unfold the way that I think of when we were in middle school. We used to have these little papers that, you could flip a few times and it would say yes, maybe, no. And it was sort of like a little riddle in paper. And that's kind of how this thing unfolds. And so there's a quote in there I love, but I'm not gonna bring that one out because it is such a big transition there. So let me talk about the criticisms. I have one major criticism, and that is the female character Doris is very important throughout different timelines within the book, and for the narrator, who is the translator, as well as the author that the narrator's translating, as well as the translator of that author that the narrator is translating. So all three men, and also a father of one of the men as well. So through all these different timelines, there's a lot of sex scenes in it. No problem with that at all. In fact, I think it makes sense because of the nature of their conflict. We should throw some passion in there. But the sex scenes are just so male-dominated fantasy. I understand that the book is written by a man. I understand that these three characters that are in conflict over the translation and of the woman are all men. But the way that it is written, I think, just takes away a little bit from the character of Doris because it makes her many times solely an object, a sexual object that is just performing sex in a way that I think is the way that we as men, like to sort of fantasize and the gross pornographic minds that we have, as opposed to any sort of equal power situation, maybe is a great way to put it. I mean, all of her power seems too bound up in pleasure and what she can provide for these men. Now, that's a criticism of the book, but it may need to be written that way. The author could sit down with me and say, well, because of X, Y, and Z, you're reading it right, but this is exactly why it has to be done. And that may be true, but it's something that there's so many of those scenes that honestly you kind of think about a lot. And so maybe there's just a little bit too much of it. And the point of those was made, without having to kind of keep returning to it. So I'll return to the actual translator of this real novel that I'm holding in my hand and not the metafiction we're discussing, is a woman, which, very interesting, because as I said, throughout the text, you're sitting there wondering, did she mess with the text? I am going to guess no, because of the nature of the woman in this story and, frankly, the sex scenes. They are just too male. And they are too focused on the identity and needs of a male from a sexual prowess standpoint, as opposed to anything that I would think of more so coming from the perspective of a woman. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. And like I said, the book definitely invites you to think throughout about how much this particular translation might have been screwed with. And I take it from those scenes that perhaps not at all. And Emma Ramadan's, actually, I mentioned this in the last review I did, just like coincidence is, I think, well, not coincidence because I guess they're in love and married, but coincidence in my mind is the wife and co-owner with Tom, I don't know his last name, but for Riff Raff Books in Providence, Rhode Island, which is, it sounds amazing and I really want to go. It is a bar, coffee shop, and also a bookstore, I think, that does a lot of literary translation stuff. And I get to go to Massachusetts. My wife's family's from Massachusetts. We get there a couple times a year. And on my next trip, I'm going to sneak away to Providence, Rhode Island, and buy all their books. So they're warned. And she has done some incredible translations. It's not the first time I've run into her. This is just the first time that I made that connection, that this was someone connected to another part of the literary translated world that I know about. She's extremely talented. And I would love to have a conversation with her at some point about translating this book, not just because of the elements of you're translating a book as a translator about translators and translations. Of course, that would be fascinating, but also some of the male-dominated stuff I talked about as well, because I'm curious what she was thinking, about that material as she was translating it, if she shared those thoughts, or if she, perhaps like the author, felt that that was an important and necessary sort of role for the woman to play within the book and for the sex to kind of represent. So that's my review. This one was a little tougher because it's kind of difficult to talk too much about it without giving away so much of the fun. So I'm just going to say that I think you absolutely need to read this book if you like translated fiction. It gives us as readers a great opportunity to ask ourselves, what are we reading, and who is the author of the text versus how it's being translated. I've heard before some people have commented that the reason they don't like reading literary translations is because they're not reading the original text, and I absolutely hate that argument for many, many reasons. But one is it really reduces the role of the translator. The translator is an artist and technician. It is both things. And anytime that we see a play or we see a movie, we are watching a translation. And it is the translators that bring these amazing worlds to life and make my mind expand and make my world not seem so small, and allow us to be able to step into these worlds that would be totally unfamiliar to us. And so the sort of idea, I guess, that you're not reading the original text, it just falls very, very flat to me. And I think this book does a great job in many ways of laying that to waste, even though he is messing with the original text, right? Because you do understand sort of the conflict between the translator and the author and how this plays out behind the scenes, whereas by the time we get a novel that's been translated, that all of those issues, whether they're minor or big, they've been resolved, their decisions have been made, and here is this piece of art. And that piece of art is different than the original text, of course, but it is a piece of art on its own completely, and we have the translators to thank, love, appreciate, pay more, put on the front cover of books for bringing that to life. And so this is an absolute must read. I think so far it's probably a top 3 for me. I will admit that when I was about halfway through, I think I tweeted out something like, this is a masterpiece. And while there's a great kind of twist towards the end, I do think it loses a little steam. It may be about 15 to 20 pages of extra stuff that we don't totally need, like the themes kind of hit us. And so I'll just say that that's another kind of small criticism. Very weird for me to have a book I love so much and yet to have one serious criticism and other kind of smaller things. Another smaller one is that, I said it's very easy to follow, whether it's Abel Prout, David Gray, who's his translator, or Trad, the translator of this, who it is that is kind of narrating a piece. And it is because of the format. But another small complaint is their voices are identical. David Gray, the American translator, a little bit less so, only because he doesn't get as much first-person narration time. But for the others, they seem very, very similar. It's a very type of man, and it's not, honestly, not someone that you would want to spend a ton of time with. It may be a stereotype of a writer that is correct, and I think in some ways probably is. Again, a stereotype, not necessarily the truth, but an idea that certain people have of a male chauvinist writer. I think that they just share a little too much in common, and in some ways I was reading it and I was thinking, well, that makes sense because this is supposed to blur the lines between who is writing what, and since it's a translation, of course, the voices and when I was going to feel the same, But because you're doing a conflict and a push and pull between the two, I thought there should be a little bit more of a difference, of a gulf. You would think Trad, as the fictional translator, would actually want to create a little more of a gulf between him and Abel Prout, and I don't think that he did. But that's enough criticism. I think you can just tell from the way that I'm still thinking about this and trying to understand it in my head that this was a deeply affecting book. And some of the internal criticisms that I have just sort of show you how powerful and important, actually, I think it is. So, really quickly, though, I do want to shout out, since I was talking about Deep Vellum, my favorite book so far this year, I'm not going to have time to review because it was a very long time ago that I read it, but is Arafi, The Wasteland. It is about an Austrian scientist who studies the names of places. He goes to this wasteland in Iceland, this glacier area, to study the Icelandic names. And he comes out to a visitor center injured. He's got a nasty bite on his leg. And then the whole story is told through the medical report of the odd, very weird veterinarian who becomes his caretaker. This book is crazy, and it is awesome. So I recommend that for anyone who hasn't read it or hasn't heard of it. That's definitely one to check out. That's it for today. My next review is going to be The Incompletes by Sergio Chevek, and it is translated from the Spanish by Heather Cleary. This is an open letter book. One of my favorite publishers. Again, they're out of Rochester, New York. And I have you can see here, I need some new bookmarks since I've got my son's Pokemon card stuck in there. I've just begun this. I'm on page 18, so I don't even have anything close to an understanding of what it is about or how much I like it yet. But that is going to be my next review. I just actually recently got a subscription to Open Letter. I love these new subscription plans that publishers are doing where, you're going to get a book every month or every time that they come out with a release. I think it is, if you're in America and the shipping isn't too bad, it's really pretty amazing. So I'm very excited about this. All right, thank you so much for watching. Hope this one wasn't too everywhere. And be good to folks.